The Apollo-Soyuz Test Program, or ASTP, was a program undertaken in 1975 between the United States and the Soviet Union. The program involved the docking of an American Apollo command module and a Soviet Soyuz capsule. The program was the first international partnership in space, during which the commander of both missions shook hands in space and lived together for a few days, conducting a variety of experiments. The Cold War began in 1947 with the Truman Doctrine, when US President Harry Truman declared the Soviet Union to be an evil empire, one that they would do anything to stop. During the Cold War, the US and USSR were in a constant state of gridlock, trying to one-up the other in preparations for a war that both feared the other would begin. The space race was a part of this, when in 1957 the USSR launched an artificial satellite known as Sputnik 1. The US feared this would be used to spy on them, but also believed the USSR would use their space technology to weaponize space. 4 years later, the USSR put the first man in space with a flight of Vostok 1. Only 3 weeks later, the US sent their own astronauts into space as part of the Mercury program. That same year, with only a combined 15 minutes of time in space, President John Kennedy declared before Congress that they needed to go to the moon. This began the Apollo program, which only 8 years later would lead to the first man on the moon being an American. This led to the USSR abandoning their own moon program, the N-1, claiming it was too unsafe and pointless to put a man on the moon. Under President Richard Nixon and President Leonid Brezhnev of the US and USSR, they sought closer relations in a policy known in the US as Detente and as Razrядka in the USSR. This saw the US and USSR try to cooperate more on a number of matters, such as the SALT I Treaty, a nuclear arms reduction treaty. In the 1970s, despite both sides critiquing the other's engineering methods, the US and USSR began discussing possible joint space operations, leading to a design known as the Androgynous Peripheral Attach System, or APAS, which would allow the Apollo and Soyuz capsules to dock to each other. In 1972, the US and USSR signed the Agreement Concerning Cooperation in the Exploration and Use of Outer Space for Peaceful Purposes, agreeing to the ASTP in 1975. The Apollo capsule was not officially numbered as it was not used during the Apollo program, but it was unofficially referred to as the Apollo 18 capsule. The Soyuz capsule was designated Soyuz 19. The Apollo capsule would be carried into space by a Saturn 1B, a smaller version of the Saturn V used for testing the early Apollo capsules that wouldn't be going to the moon. Where the lunar lander would normally be held, the APAS was kept. The Soyuz capsule was a modified version of the Soyuz 11 capsule, designated the Soyuz 7KTM. It was modified to accept the APAS docking module and had its batteries replaced with solar panels, as the original was designed to dock to the Salyut space station, which would then charge the batteries. A total of 6 of these capsules were made for the program. 2 were used as uncrewed satellites, 1 was used during the Soyuz 16 flight to test the capsule while crewed, 1 was used as a hot backup, being placed on a fully fueled rocket, while the last one was used as a cold backup, being placed on an empty rocket. The Apollo capsule was crewed by 3 men, Tom Stafford, Vance Brand and Deke Slayton. Tom Stafford had the most experience, being the commander of Apollo 10, and was thus designated the American commander of the program. The Soyuz flew with 2 men, Alexei Leonov and Valery Kubasov. Both had comparable experience, and Alexei Leonov was designated the Soviet commander. The Soyuz and Apollo rockets took off on the 15th of July 1975, within 7.5 hours of each other at Baikonur Site 15 and Kennedy LC-39B, respectively. 2 days later, the capsules docked in space. The commanders of the program were planned to shake hands over Bognor, England, but due to delays they ended up shaking hands over the French city of Metz, marking a historical day of peace and cooperation between 2 enemies. The astronauts and cosmonauts received a written statement from Leonid Brezhnev and a phone call from President Gerald Ford. They also exchanged a variety of gifts, such as tree seeds, flags, and music. They also visited each other's capsules, ate with each other, and conversed in both English and Russian, with Alexei Leonov joking about Tom Stafford's Oklahoman accent, saying 3 languages were spoken: English, Russian, and Oklahomsky. The Americans and Soviets also conducted a variety of scientific experiments. After 44 hours of being docked, they separated for one last experiment. The Apollo capsule maneuvered itself in front of the sun, creating an artificial eclipse and allowing the Soviets to take a picture of the sun's corona. The 2 capsules then docked one last time before going their separate ways. The Americans stayed in space for 5 more days, conducting Earth observation experiments, while the Soviets stayed in space for 2 more days. During re-entry, the Apollo capsule suffered a failure. During the pre-entry checklist, Vance Brand missed a step, leading to the air intake valves being left open, leading to toxic fumes entering the capsule. During re-entry, Vance Brand briefly lost consciousness. The astronauts were hospitalized for 2 weeks in Honolulu before being let out with no permanent injuries. Despite this, the program was still a great success. In technological terms, the US and USSR developed a technology that would allow for possible future missions in the form of the APAS. Scientifically speaking, a number of experiments were conducted, such as studying the effects of weightlessness on fish eggs. The Soviets also got a picture of the solar corona. The biggest success in this program was a political and cultural one. The ASTP was a part of the linkage politics of the time, during which the Americans and Soviets were trying to link their countries together, hoping for peaceful coexistence. Both sides also managed to greatly downplay the other's contributions, making themselves seem greater in comparison. The commanders also became friends after the mission, with Leonev being the godfather of Stafford's youngest children. The Apollo-Soyuz Test Program was a brilliant one, bringing 2 great powers and their people closer together and establishing space as a place for peace, not war. The program was important and remained so, with design cues from this program being used for the current International Space Station.